In the West, we are richer than we've ever been. We have more leisure time, more opportunities, more freedom, and at the same time, we have more divorce, more depression, more burnout, more stress-related illness, more suicide. In other words, more of everything except fulfillment. What's going on? We actually find the answer in an Old Testament book called Jeremiah. It was written in the 7th century BC, and it is a remarkable description of the relationship between God and the ancient people of Israel. Israel is described as God's bride, with God as her devoted husband. He loves her with all of his heart, and she loves him devotedly. She trusts him, and she follows him. God says, I remember the devotion of your youth. How as a bride you loved me and followed me through the wilderness. That's a picture of what happened when God led his people out of slavery in Egypt. He led them towards a new home, a beautiful new land where they would be free to enjoy him forever. And he provided food and water for them as they traveled through the wilderness. But then something devastating happens. God's people abandon God, and they chase after other gods instead. To use the language of the Bible, God's bride commits idolatry, an act of spiritual adultery. And this isn't just a one-off, a momentary lapse. It happens repeatedly. He loves like a faithful husband, but again and again, God's people give their love to other things instead. They seek satisfaction elsewhere. The language in Jeremiah is devastating. God says, you have lived as a prostitute with many lovers. In fact, God's people are shown as worse than a prostitute. A prostitute, after all, is paid for what she does. But God's people went after things which didn't pay. God says, my people have committed 2 sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. In other words, the things that they traded in for God, the things that they'd exchanged instead of him, they could not bring fulfillment. And it is a senseless, shocking betrayal of the one who loved them so faithfully. But actually, even more of a shock is the realization that this is also a picture of us. We could be, should be, enjoying the source of all fulfillment, but we don't trust him. And so we seek fulfillment elsewhere. But don't we know from our own experience that except for perhaps a short time, these things never fill us up? We get the next pay rise, and pretty soon it's not enough. We get that dream wife or husband, and pretty soon they're not enough. We go after these things, expecting so much, and every time we're just disappointed. There's always the hangover, the morning after. We wake up and we say to ourselves, this isn't what I hoped it would be. All our dreams come false. You see, looking to these things to try to fulfill us is like trying to lick up moisture from a dusty, dried up cistern. They just weren't designed to satisfy in that way. Yet back we go again and again to the same broken cisterns. If we crave lasting fulfillment, we need to go to the source. We need to go to the God who describes himself in Jeremiah as the spring of living water. Fast forward 700 years. You can read about this in John chapter 4. Jesus sits by a well in a place called Samaria. A Samaritan woman comes to take water from the well. Now, as a Samaritan, she's a racial and religious outcast. As a woman, she has no power and is looked down on. Yet Jesus reaches out to her. He asks her for a drink. And she's shocked. She says to Jesus, "You're a Jew and I'm a Samaritan woman. How can you ask me for a drink?" And Jesus says something staggering. He tells her, if you understood who I am, you would be asking me for a drink, and I would give you living water. He is identifying himself here with the God who speaks in Jeremiah, who calls himself the spring of living water. But the woman misses it. She's still thinking of literal water. She says, sir, you have nothing to draw with and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Jesus says, everyone who drinks this water, the water in the well, will be thirsty again. But then Jesus says this, whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. You hear what Jesus is holding out to us? An end to the spiritual thirst that's dogged us all our lives. That never-ending quest for fulfillment. He's saying, don't try to be satisfied with broken, dried-up cisterns. Career, relationships, material things. They're all good, but they can't quench the deeper thirst. They're gifts from the one who can. Come to the source of all these good things. The woman at the well was an outsider, an outcast in every imaginable way. Because of her beliefs, she was a religious outcast. Because of her race, she was an ethnic outcast. Because of her gender, she was a social outcast. And then we learned something else as well. Because of her life choices, she was a moral outcast. You see, the other women would have come to draw their water early in the day when it was cooler. But the text says this woman came to the well alone at midday, when the sun was hottest. Why? Because none of the other women, even the women from her own community, wanted to associate with her. And Jesus knew why. Without her even having to say so, he knows all about her checkered sexual history. In that culture, to have had 3 husbands meant that you were written off as an immoral woman. Jesus says, I know that you've had 5 husbands in the past. And the man you're living with now, you're not married to. Now, can you see the significance of that? The woman Jesus spoke to at the well was exactly like Jeremiah's description of God's people. A serial adulteress, seeking fulfillment everywhere but in God. Trying to draw water from broken cisterns that can't ultimately satisfy. She is so far from God that even her own people refuse to associate with her. But how does Jesus relate to her? With tenderness, with gentleness, with love. He engages with her. He speaks kindly to her. He associates with her. And he crosses all the boundaries we set up for ourselves. And he does all of this so that he can offer her the water that she's really been looking for all of her life. And if there is hope for her, can't you see there's hope for all of us? Imagine one day you switch on the TV and you see a news report about the royal family and your jaw drops. In a shocking revelation, the palace confirmed that one of the royal princes has married a prostitute. And then you see her. She's been living on the streets. She is dealing with a mountain of unpaid debt, so she's homeless. She's dirty, she's hungry and thirsty. There is nothing remotely attractive about her. And then the cameras cut to an interview with the prince himself. And he says, I've always loved her. I loved her from the very beginning. And I'll continue to love her regardless of who she is and what she's done. Nothing will separate us. And then the cameras cut away to members of the public. They ask people what they think. And there is uproar. How on earth can this woman become his wife? How could she ever be queen after all she's done? It is a disgrace to the entire royal family, not just the prince. And of course, in a sense, they're right, because for the prince to marry her, he has to accept the shame connected with her. He has to be willing to associate with her, bind himself to her, be joined to her. pay off the debt she can't pay. He has to pay a huge price. But that is just a tiny glimpse of what Jesus Christ has done for his people. For people like you and me. God says that he chose his people before the creation of the world. He loved them faithfully. And he never stopped loving them. Even when they betrayed him, when they went off after other gods. On the cross, Jesus Christ associated himself with us. He bound himself to us. He paid off the debts that we can't possibly pay. He took on our shame and disgrace. He paid a huge price. And not just shame, but punishment. All the punishment we deserve for wandering away from God and looking to broken systems for our satisfaction. He willingly took that punishment on himself on the cross, on our behalf. All so that we could be united to him and be fulfilled in him forever. Can you see how much he loves you and how much that love cost him? Imagine at the end of the news report, the camera cuts back to the prince and he looks straight into the camera and he says, I know exactly who she is. I know exactly what she's done, but I'm the future king. I marry who I choose to marry. And whatever she may have been, her status changed forever when I married her. Whatever she may have done, she has been welcomed into my family. Everything I have is now hers. I belong to her and she belongs to me. And she will never want for anything again. And near the end of John's Gospel, John records what Jesus said just before he died on the cross. Jesus cried out on the cross, I am thirsty. The spring of living water himself was thirsty, so that we would never have to be thirsty again.